Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring the human risk dynamics of something that I know many of you will have done for fun while on a holiday. Scuba diving. My guest, Gareth Lock, is the founder of The Human Diver, a company that specialises in human factors in diving. And Gareth helps to make diving safer by training people on the human dynamics that can occur during and around dives. The lessons we can learn from that are relevant for other contexts as well. Whether you've ever been diving or not, it's fairly obvious that it's an activity that comes with a degree of inherent risk. After all, it involves getting into an environment that requires us to use specialist equipment, because being underwater impacts our ability to breathe naturally and diminishes the use of some of our senses. It also exposes us to some potentially dangerous conditions: temperature, currents and air pressure for starters, not to mention the sea creatures we come across who aren't necessarily always going to welcome our intrusion into their world. As Gareth explains in our discussion, those dynamics can be made far worse by humans. Most accidents and incidents in diving aren't down to technical failures, rather they're down to complacency, breakdowns in communication, poor decision-making, a lack of situational awareness, or ineffective teamwork and or leadership. In other words, human risk. What I found really fascinating about my conversation with Gareth is that I thought diving would be tightly regulated by an independent body. It really isn't. And for those human factors to be well understood in the industry, they're really not. Which is where Gareth comes in to plug the gap. So whether you're a highly experienced diver or have never even tried it, what you're about to hear are some fascinating insights that are relevant to other contexts as well. So please enjoy my conversation with Gareth Lock on human risk in diving. Gareth, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Christian, for the invitation. I'm intrigued and I'm looking forward to this.
It's an absolute thrill to have you here. And I obviously know who you are, but can you give my listeners a little bit of sense of you, your background, and what you do?
Yeah, so I have a very varied background. I suppose that's what probably gives me a sort of diverse view of the world. So I left school at 18, I joined the Air Force, I went flying for 10 years or so on Hercules transport aircraft. I was a flight instructor teaching low-level operations and tactical operations. I then moved into the academic space. I did a master's in aerospace systems, which was a bit of a crash course in anything to do with aerospace, really. I then went to work in a trials organization at Boscombe Down, Kinetic. I then went to work in research and development, working with some very bright scientists and acting as what I would describe as a Babel fish in a telephone directory. So I would take geek speak and convert it into operator frontline or strategic thinking speak, and then take their views and then convert it back to geek speak. And then the last 5 years I spent was in procurement and systems engineering, putting defensive aid systems on helicopters and transport aircraft, stop them getting shot down in hostile areas. So working again with sort of frontline industry research. And then in February 14, I gave my notice in. I had to give a year's notice to the Air Force, and I left in February 15. And I set up my own business and started working in the oil and gas sector, teaching the stuff that I teach in the diving industry, which I'll come on to in a minute. But ultimately, we did an eight-month job out in Qatar, which was fantastic, working on oil rigs, working with the guys. And then the bottom fell out the oil market. So there's no money for training. So training's the first thing that gets canned. And then, in sort of 2005 is when I sort of got re-interested in diving. And I've been trying to bring some of my human factor stuff into that. And so in February 15, so I left the Air Force. January 16, I formed, I suppose, the predecessor of the Human Diver, which is my company. And the idea being to teach crew resource management, non-technical skills to the diving industry. And the first couple of pilot classes went down really well. Lots of enjoyment. People went, this is what we need to be taught. Have no idea how you're going to market it because it's not how the industry works. And since January 16, I've been teaching human factors and non-technical skills around the world, really. So I've taught around about 350 people face-to-face, about 1,000 people online. I wrote a book in March 19 called Under Pressure, which is if anybody has seen or
it's not a David Bowie Queen biopic.
No, it's not. No, lots of people go, oh yeah, there we go. There's the music. No, Under Pressure, diving deeper with human factors, and that's self-published. And it's not just a diving book. It's useful for all sorts of people involved in risk, teamwork, and then so the idea really for that book was to act as really a sort of a textbook that would contain theory and stories. So there's about 30 plus stories in there of people having adverse events occur. And then I use that as the basis for the theory of that chapter. So each chapter had 2 or 3 stories in it. And then in May 2020, released a documentary called If Only, which was based or was inspired by Martin Bromley's Just a Routine Operation, which some of your listeners may have heard of. And the idea is it tells a story of a fatality, a diving fatality in Hawaii, through the lens of human factors and just culture, and showing people that those adverse events, those accidents that we see are not just the sort of brain farts that people have and they think, God, that's obvious. Why would you get in the water with your oxygen cylinder turned off? That's a basic premise that you need to have gas to breathe, and you've got to have a checklist there. And you start telling this story and people go, oh, well, things are a lot more complicated than that. And I went, oh, yes, they are way more complicated. And just focusing on little technical aspects of people's skills is not enough. We've got to look at the non-technical skills, the human factors, just culture, psychological safety. And then, so that's basically me up to date. And then in September, I'm running the first ever Human Factors in Diving conference. I'm bringing 28 other speakers together to talk about the whole spectrum of diving and how human factors fits into it.
Wow. What an amazing career. I love that. And you're clearly doing something that you're passionate about now, because I guess you wouldn't set that sort of business up if you didn't have some form of passion for the activity and trying to, I guess, improve safety in that space. And as I look at diving, I mean, I was saying to you before we started recording, I've done some diving in my time. I haven't done it for a few years. But it always struck me that it was incredibly well regulated and controlled. And so when you say there are all these incidents, actually that, as somebody that's participated and observed what's going on, it always felt, I mean, providing you went with a sort of civilized, regulated operator, generally speaking, the risks of things going wrong seemed to be, it felt exciting and dangerous, but actually you sensed there was a huge amount of safety there. So I'm fascinated when you talk in those terms, because it seemed to me, looking from the outside, that it's an industry that is actually very, very safe, in spite of the fact the underlying activity is quite, could be dangerous.
Yeah, it is a sort of a perverse situation. The industry is marketed as a sport for all, and it's a holiday type situation, and the way that all the marketing is there, and statistically, diving is pretty safe. It's in the order of something like 1 in 150 to 1 in 350,000 dives ends up as a fatality. But fatalities are a pretty poor metric of safety. There are lots of near misses that happen out there, and it doesn't take a lot to step between well, that was exciting, to, oh, that was really not a nice place to be a fatality. And I sort of often joke in saying that, unless you've got gills, you're pretty poorly placed when you're underwater when things go wrong. And physiologically, we are pretty robust beings. So, you can have a rapid ascent following a running out of gas situation, and you're probably not going to die. You're going to have a fairly big decompression overhead before you end up having a serious issue from the bends. But the number of events where people are scared off from the sport, or they've had a bad experience and decided, you know what, I'm just going to give up, when it doesn't need to be that way. It is definitely at the recreational level, in some areas, it's definitely a sausage machine type situation, where you've got people coming in for lifestyle reasons. It's, sort of 2 to 5 years you spend in there, and then you realize that this is not a great place to be, that the money is not particularly good. You've had your fun, and now you move on. And the industry, whilst you say it's heavily regulated, actually it's a self-regulated industry. So there is no overall regulatory body that looks at how stuff is done. Within the UK, the Health and Safety Executive look at work diving. So there are frameworks or accepted codes of practice which you don't have to comply to, but it's a good idea that you do. But that only considers when you're at work. When you're in, I'm going to say, fun diving, so you're outside of a training environment, you're now managing risk or uncertainty of your own back. And that means that most of the time you're doing it through cognitive biases and not through formal risk management processes. And because we don't talk in the diving industry, things don't get talked about very often, the near misses, because there isn't a just culture that allows people to talk about it. The bias says, well, I haven't heard anything go wrong, therefore it must be okay. And yet when you start having conversations with people, you go, oh yeah, well, I had this event and I had this, and it's like, ooh, okay. So there's a lot of stuff out there. So it's a fascinating area to look at in terms of risk thresholds and what you perceive to be risky or not. Because I've just finished doing a training course on a rebreather, which is a piece of equipment that will mix gas inside the breathing loop, so it keeps me alive. It's an automated system, which means that it could fail, and the more that you automate something, the less people pay attention to it. That's one of the cognitive biases we have. But I could go off and do, say, a 50-meter dive. I'd have 30 minutes decompression overhead. I know some people go, that'd be mad. Why would I do that? I have friends who go cave diving. You go, that's just absolutely stupid. And you go, yeah, but it's this bit of being properly equipped and trained to have the right mindset, dealing with the failures to increase the certainty that you have a positive outcome rather than a negative one.
I'll retract my statements about the regulation because I had assumed that there was a body looking at it, which is interesting that there isn't necessarily. Is the bigger risk, I guess, people like me coming in and being amateurs, or is it professionals with blind spots, or is it a combination of both?
So there is, I'm going to say, one of the difficulties is there's a real paucity of data. There's a real lack of data as to show where problems lie. When novices come into the sport, they are definitely in the unknowns category. They don't know what they don't know, and even worse, they don't know. I mean, my old, I had a marketing coach, and she learned to dive on a cruise liner. And she went out to the Caribbean. She learned in the back of a pool, and they were going to a dive site, which was a shark nursery. And there were loads of people go, oh no, sharks, dangerous. Not going to get in the water because I might get eaten. And her rationale was, well, they wouldn't arrange this activity if it was dangerous. You're going to lose, risk losing some of your fare paying.
Well, it's not as smart, but you wouldn't do it as a sustainable business.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. So she said, I'll go and do this. So all she's done is diving in the swimming pool in the back of this cruise liner. So they then go and dive down a 30-meter wall, which goes down another 150, 200 meters down below them, completely oblivious to the diving risks. So she's down way deeper than where she should be. She's got nitrogen narcosis, so she's off her face going swimming around going, hey, this is really nice. And just thinking she's a mermaid. And the instructor or the guide is like, right, okay, time to go up, and shows her a thumb. She's like, yeah, this is nice. It's like, no, we got to go. Yeah, right, and pulls her up. And she was completely oblivious to the risk. So there's this ultimate trust in the guide or the instructor because they don't know any better. At the other end of the scale, you end up with the complacency as a human behavior that says, as we get more skilled at something, we pay less attention to it. And I get really quite wound up when people go, oh, they were complacent. Well, you only know they were complacent after the event, because if things go really well, we call it efficiency. When they go wrong, we call it complacency. And it's almost exactly the same activities, at least cognitively anyway, that we're doing. So there's a spectrum of education required, but for different reasons of managing those uncertainties that are out there.
And it's amazing when you put it in those really simple terms, and this will chime with the audience in a ton of other contexts. I mean, we're talking about human beings, and so you can change the context, but they're still human beings. But it's fascinating that, back to my earlier point about the regulation, this seems really, really important, right? This is a fundamental driver of risk in this activity, which the more you describe the activity, the more I would kind of go, why are we doing this, right? It seems crazy in some respects. And I was trying to find a good analogy for something else that contains similar levels of risk that we just sort of rock up and do on holiday. I guess sort of any adrenaline sports is probably the closest to that we get to that sort of space. It's amazing, firstly, I guess, that the activity is permitted in sort of, but secondly, that a lot of these things you're talking about haven't been considered until you came along and started really highlighting them.
True. So in terms of analogous sports, you'd probably say mountain walking, maybe winter mountaineering. And the thing is that if you end up with adrenaline in those sports, it means that something's gone wrong, because actually you don't want to be in a situation where you are running on adrenaline because your capacity is limited. And when people go, "Oh, cave diving must be really exciting," it's like, no, it's quite serene. It's there. Now, if you step over that threshold that goes from oh, it's all going horribly wrong, then it can get very serious very quickly. So why isn't it regulated? Because it's a hobby, it's a sporting activity, and yes, it has got some inherent hazards that are in there. And when I say it's not regulated, there's no official bodies like government bodies. What there are things like the World Recreational Scuba Training Council. So they will set global standards at quite a high level. But that training council is made up of the training agencies which will inherit the regulations that come down. So it's not in their interest commercially to make things really strict in terms of the training that's provided, because describe it's a bit of a self-licking lollipop, or the turkeys voting for Christmas because they're like, yeah, it's great. Why would that be the case? And so it is really difficult to make a sort of a headway into the market for this, for the work that I'm doing, because it's not how I'm going to say risk is managed in the industry. Risk is almost transferred to the lowest levels possible. The training agencies are there. They've got training programs. They've got a form of quality control or quality assurance that's there that tries to ensure that the materials they publish that get given to the instructor trainers and then the instructors to deliver to the students and the clients, that's done in a safe way. But there's nothing that really looks at individual failure or organizational failure or supervisory failure, the sort of thing that human factors professionals would look at it in a systems way. It's very much done at an individual level, almost like aviation was 50 years ago. Pilot error, flew the aircraft into the ground, it's his fault. Whereas if we look at why divers have accidents, we often just at the moment focus on that proximal cause, the time and space in which it happened, as opposed to looking at the context and the decision making, what had happened in the day, the week, or the month, or the years beforehand. Because actually there's no established investigation protocols that look at why things occur. So, I've been doing this for about 10 years now, and pretty much everybody who comes in contact is like, wow, this should be there. And then I take a systems view of it and say, the reason why it's not is because it's not a commercial product. It's not something that's commercially viable. And because there are no standards that say deliver non-technical skills or human factors training or develop a just culture, there is no organizational interest to put something like this in place.
I mean, that's really, really interesting because if you sort of look at, if I think about other risky contexts where there's a consumer element, so airlines would be a good example. It is, as you rightly point out, it's in the airline's self-interest not to have planes falling out of the sky. And so there's a certain amount of self-regulation. Now, admittedly, you then on top of that have a regulatory body that sort of ensures societal needs are met as well. So encourages them to go possibly further than they might do naturally anyway. Mm-hmm. But you've got those factors. But what you're talking about here really is an industry that, particularly, I guess, with some of the dynamics of the people that are involved in it and your comment around lifestyle businesses, and I guess some of the locations where this takes place, because the majority of people, I'm assuming, or at least this describes my previous history, are going and doing it in nice sunny climes in warm water, as opposed to some of the slightly colder offerings that we might have here in the UK. And so if you add all that together, in many respects, I might come at the opposite way and say it's almost surprising that we don't have more accidents in many respects.
Totally. And that's something that, you just look at this. And so from I'm going to say a modern safety view is, what is it then that people are doing that's creating safety dynamically? Now, there could be a significant amount of luck that's on there. And more goes right than wrong, definitely. I mean, you've probably got more risk of being injured or killed driving to the dive site than you do on the dive site itself. And this is the weird thing about how people perceive and manage their own risks, what they think is scary. So the shark event earlier that I was talking about, what people think is risky and dangerous actually isn't the bit that's more dangerous. It's the fact that you have no idea about your buoyancy control, gas consumption, and the fact that if you sank, you'd be a long way down and you would be unrecoverable. So this is this piece of cognitive bias. Diving is statistically safe, but we don't. I wrote a blog that said, the risk of a fatality is 1 in 200,000, but you can't be 1 in 200,000th dead. It's,
right, it's a binary thing. Right?
Yeah, it's the way we think. We're rubbish at dealing with those sorts of numbers. Well, 1 in 200,000. Well, I'm never going to do 200,000 dives. Therefore, I'm not going to die when I dive. And people go, that's a really stupid way of thinking about it. I went, well, no, that's, if you think about it logically, yes, it is. But we don't think like that. We're emotional creatures, and we're trying to find the shortcuts all the time. And you explain to people, this is how you think and how you manage risk or how you manage uncertainty. Because there's another piece I'm trying to get across is, in diving, we don't manage risk because risk is often done in quantitative ways. And I say okay, so what's the probability of you having an event when you go diving? Well, I don't know. Wet finger in the air and off you go. So actually what we're trying to do is manage uncertainties, and those uncertainties are managed through cognitive biases and heuristics, mental shortcuts. And if we can better inform those, then we're much better at managing the uncertainty. What we should be doing is increasing certainty, not managing risk. So I might have an emergency action plan that says, if something goes wrong, what am I going to do about it? Okay, when was the last time you practiced those skills? When was the last time you validated something that you're relying on as part of your contingencies? Well, I haven't. Right, so how do you know that it's going to work? Well, because I was trained 5 years ago to do that. Right, okay. So there is a huge amount of, I'm going to say, background or contextual stuff that needs to be, or an educational process that needs to happen before you can say, do this. Because actually, if you don't understand this, and I'm drawing big pictures here with my hands, if you don't understand the big picture, then it's very difficult to understand the little pieces and where they fit in.
When you point those things out to people that you're training, I'm assuming you get the normal reaction when one starts to explore behavioral science, which is like, oh, wow, it's sort of people's realization that you're onto something. It kind of rings a bell with them. And that's one thing. But of course, we know that just knowing that we're biased isn't enough to be able to de-bias ourselves, because that sort of is built into the operating system. And anybody that kids themselves, they can de-bias themselves just by knowing they're biased, is onto a bit of a loser, as we know. So what you're doing there and what you were talking about is this idea of, well, we have to build structures that accommodate those biases and recognize that they're there and therefore design with them. Is that how you look at this? In other words, you're building processes and structures to sort of compensate, if you like, for the biases that people will display.
Yeah, and so the sort of the training that I started in January 16 was based around a computer-based simulation called GemmaSim, because I realized that there's probably a market for something like this in the diving industry, but people were not going to sit in a classroom. They needed to have something to make it real, to bring it sort of experiential or tangible. So I found this computer-based simulation, which was used in a number of different domains. But the idea is you create a stressful, uncertain environment in a computer-based simulation operating as a team of four. And you can use people's behaviors in a psychologically safe environment. It doesn't matter if people fail because there's no professional jeopardy. And then you use sort of reflective debriefs and coaching to say, right, so you just experienced jumping to conclusions because of some information that was there. Where does that happen in your diving? And then you start exploring some stories. And then two real simple tools. One is an effective briefing tool, and the other one is an effective debriefing tool. So that, briefing is about increasing certainty for the task ahead, but there's going to be some contingencies. So you're going to have to plan for those emergency type situations. Then you go off and do your dive. And when you come back, you debrief it and you go through a structured debrief that I've created that basically is all about learning. And the idea then is you learn from what's happened, or at least you've identified issues. And then part of the debrief structure is, what are you going to change the next time? So what that does is then sets you up for better successes the next time you go diving. So you brief and you remember what you learned the last time, and then you move on. There isn't really a structured learning process outside of a training environment. So, a dive training course, students are given skills and knowledge to, in effect, pass a course and prepare them for diving in the real world. When they go out in the real world, nobody's given them the skills on how to learn from experience out there, which is what the sort of the key areas are. So giving that structured learning is one, but also getting them to do reflective exercises where they'll review a video or a case study, look at the factors that are there, and then say, and where are the parallels in your diving? And people go, this is really hard. I've got to look at this. And there aren't any answers. So I know, because these are your answers that I'm trying to pull out of you to make it real, because I don't have all of your answers. You can come to me and say, I've got a problem, or I've got a situation, or I've got an example. How do I deal with this? And I can pull it apart, and then they can, rebuild it with them. But there is no way that I would have been able to think of that situation off pat and say, and this applies, because there are just so many variables that are there. So it's getting people to critically think about what they do.
You've really hit a topic that resonates hugely with me as I look across a range of industries, which is this idea of, we investigate when things go wrong. We might just about investigate near misses if we kind of have to, because it was really close. But in most cases, if it goes quote unquote right, we don't bother. Right? There's no need to review it because it was fun. And of course, that ignores we got away with it, or a huge amount of luck, or just the unique set of circumstances. We tend not to like to look back on that. So what you've done there is created this. I mean, it's an artificial structure, and I say artificial in the sense of it's not something we naturally do, to force people to reflect on what's just happened in a way that we wouldn't ordinarily do. So I think that's a lovely example of forcing a behavior on people that is so far away from the way we like to think.
Oh, totally. And, whilst I've spent a fair amount of my time in the diving industry, I've also worked in healthcare, doing some work with software teams, and done some work with rail, with power generation. People are people. You sort of touched on it earlier. This stuff is transplantable across different domains. And I find it quite amusing at the moment that I've taken my materials from aviation, healthcare, oil and gas, nuclear, repackaged it into diving speak and make it accessible to those. And now I've got safety professionals and operational leaders coming into my diving programs to take my diving materials to take back to their non-diving environment. Because it's applicable. It's like, yeah, we know that. So, and the learning that the debrief structure is, it is the word debrief, define the aims and goals of the task. Did we achieve them? And how long is the debrief going to take? So we bound the debrief. Then we create psychological safety through an example. So the easiest way to make people feel at ease is talk about something that didn't go quite well or on that particular task. So you show you're fallible, even though you might be an instructor or an instructor trainer, there is always something that didn't go quite right. And that might mean you need to go digging deeper for that. So you create a safe environment. Then we could talk about the background, so the planning phase before you start executing. Briefly review the timeline, and then the real learning happens in the letters I and E. So that's individual. What did I do well and why? And what do I need to improve on and how am I going to do it? So the bit about focusing on the positive, well, why was I good about this? And then what do I need to improve on and how? And the why and the how are the two hardest questions. People are great at observing things that have happened, good or bad. It takes a lot of thought to go and dig into the why and why did it go well so I can reinforce it and how am I going to fix it? So that's the individual bit. The E is as the team, external. So what did the team do well and why? And what did the team need to improve on and how are they going to fix it? So you do the same thing, but you've got a slightly different perspective. And then the F of debrief is follow up or file, which is what are you going to actually change? Are you going to put an incident report in? Are you going to put a learning, a social media post together? Are you going to go and fix your dive gear? I went diving yesterday and I put a hole in my wrist seals for my dry suits. It's like, right, make a note straight away, go and put some Aquashore on those. Because often people go, yeah, I'll look at that. They put the gear away, and then in the morning, it might be a month later, they get it out and they go, hang on, I've already paid for this trip, and I'll push the boundaries because they've got some costs involved. And it'll be, it's okay, because the last time I did this dive, it wasn't an issue, and off they go. And it's exposing these behaviors, normal human behaviors, that says this is the culmination of a whole bunch of stuff, the straw that breaks the camel's back, that leads to an adverse event.
And I love it as you were talking, because I was just thinking there are so many, to your point, there are so many scenarios in everyday life where we kind of make do with something that's sort of not quite working, and I'll just fudge it through. And it's always it's the difference between owning a home and renting a property, right? If you're renting, you'll complain when the first thing goes wrong. Yeah. If you're living in it, right, you'll just, this switch doesn't work. It might be slightly electrically dangerous, but we'll fix that one day. And I love that depiction of it, because even if you don't dive, that idea of, I've got to better do something about this. That'll happen at some point on the world's longest to-do list.
And interestingly, the class that I ran this morning, I had some homework, and one of the students on my class, she was diving in the States, and somebody had a free-flowing regulator, cold water in December, and they lost a whole bunch of gas, but it was a shallow dive. And they went, I need to deal with that. It was a low-performance regulator. They really needed to change it. Fast forward 4 months, they then go diving again. Same regulator, hadn't changed it, but it was a different team members. So this new team didn't know that there's something had gone wrong in December. And this time, that instead of being at 20 feet, they were 140 feet, and they had this free-flowing regulator. And now there's a much bigger emotional tag that goes with this, because the risks or the consequences would have been much more severe. Now, fortunately, that site they were at had changed their regulations and said, if you're going below, I think it was 90 feet, you have to have an alternate gas supply as a spare cylinder. And they moved on to that, and then they emptied the cylinder in the back because this was all free flowing. They then went and bought a new set of regulators because of this had happened. Now it's the same failure mode, it's the same environment, but the emotional attachment that goes with that failure is now much more severe. And you're sitting there going, I probably need to do something about it. And the stuff that goes around the house, until somebody gets burnt, hurt, zapped, whatever, you just live with it as an acceptable uncertainty or risk, because it's fine. I've got other things to spend my time and money on.
Right. I was really struck by your comment about thinking about other situations in which this dynamic might have arisen. And one of the things I think is really interesting is, in a world where we often try and codify things, let's have long, detailed checklists, specific rules, things you need to slavishly follow. which feels very, very safe. What that, of course, doesn't do is contemplate scenarios that may not have been in the legislator's mind. And it trains people to sort of think that's all they need to think about. So I love this idea of saying, let's just say, because you're the same, back to that thing, you're the same human being, but you may find yourself it may theoretically be a different type of scenario, but it's the same things happening. When else might that happen? Is, I think, an incredibly powerful way to look at it, because it forces us then to think about the dynamic that's going on in our heads, as opposed to being transfixed by the environment around us. So something that happens in shallow waters could also happen in deeper waters. We've got the same cognitive processes, just different things at stake. If you focus purely on the environment and not what's going on in your mind, you would miss that link.
Totally. And actually, it's one of the ways that I try and break down some of the barriers to learning. So if I go, even in the diving environment, or if I go into healthcare, dealing with surgeons, years and years of training, perfectionists don't like to be judged on their incompetencies in the technical term.
It's kind of good they're perfectionists, though, right? Because the flip side of this, I don't want a surgeon that goes, doesn't really matter whether I do this, right? But that's the interesting balancing act there.
So, and it's a really interesting bit about the perfectionist. Often perfectionists are terrible learners because they don't want to accept their failures that are there. They will hide the stuff that's going on. So when I try to bring human factors, non-technical skills, concepts into mind, I don't pick the profession, or I don't pick the diving sport. I will pick something that they can relate to. So that might be, so as an example, I was working at a gas production facility, and I said, so tell me when something that happened, I start my classes, I tell a story, and I get them to tell a story when something couldn't go quite to plan, and what they thought the reasons were. And this person was talking about coming up, and they ran into the back of a car at a roundabout because there was, they were noticed something on the other side. And I said, well, what was it? And I said, well, it was a caravan. So it's okay. Are you a caravan person? Well, no. Well, there must have been something about that on the other side that drew your attention away, because our attention is a limited capacity, and we will look at things that are dangerous, interesting, pleasurable, or important. That's the filter that says, focus over there. It's like the little dog in Up, squirrel, off you go. So if I can get them to understand their cognitive processes in a non-judgmental, non-jeopardy situation, and I say, right, this is what capacity means, this is how your attention works, this is how you process information, why you miss things in that scenario. Right, do you get how that works? Yeah, okay, fine. Right, and let's talk about your work environment. Let's talk about something that's happened here that's gone wrong. And let's talk about, the scenarios, similar scenarios to that. Okay, so what was going on in terms of work? Well, there's time pressures. We've got to get stuff done. Okay, well, that takes part of your brain's capacity away. Well, the instructions we've got are confusing. They don't follow sequentially. We have to jump around. And when we jump around, we miss certain steps. Okay, fine. So it's about creating a safe environment for learning, and then they can do the transference with some guidance as to where the issues are. And because they've done the realization of their work environment, they're more invested to create change. The difficulty is, when working at low-level supervisors and operators, they're on side. The difficulty is then getting the management in, because the management just follows what you just said, Christian. There's a bunch of rules, follow them. Yeah, but those rules don't match the operational perspective. This work is imagined, this concept of work is imagined and work is done. Work is imagined is what documented in the books, what should happen under perfect or optimal conditions, given the ideal number of resources and everything there. You give that to the worker who opens it up and goes, this person has never been on this site. Yes. They have no idea what's involved. The fact that they said use this tool to get to so-and-so, well, actually, there's no space to do that. So I have to use something else to do that. And I round the nut corners off, or I skin it's all of these workarounds that occur. And it's only when there's a number of those that have exceeded and you end up with an accident, people look back and go, well, that wasn't being followed, and that wasn't being followed, and that wasn't being followed. So I'm constantly trying to say to people, how does it make sense to do what you did? This local rationality concept. Because nobody, including the diving sport, nobody will go to work or go diving with the intention of being injured, killing somebody, damaging some equipment, whatever it is, it must make sense for them to do what it does. But it doesn't make sense to me. I wouldn't do that. I don't care. You're not that person. You have to put yourself in their shoes to understand that local rationality, because if you don't, you are never going to solve the problem.
I love that, and you're making me smile a lot, because there's it's strange. It's such a common trait, this idea of sort of, well, we'll write the rules. And I'm reminded of that sort of First World War analogy, where you've got generals sitting hundreds of miles away, possibly, or at least well away from the front, issuing orders, having no clue whatsoever about what's going on the ground. And I think we often kid ourselves nowadays that's no longer the case. I get that's a historic model.
Yeah.
That would never happen nowadays because of technology and because of but it does. And I'm struck by, there's those sort of TV shows where they take the boss back to the floor, or the undercover manager, or these sorts of things. I think the reason those shows work is precisely because there is this disconnect between the two. They are genuinely clueless, for very understandable reasons, not a criticism. They're very clueless about what's going on. So we kind of know that. And yet, as you say, we cleave to this traditional model of reliance on architecture in the loosest possible sense of the word that clearly works under certain presumptions, but those presumptions are not really valid in the real world.
Oh, totally. And it requires that ability to go and communicate. So rather than in this sort of the undercover manager, is actually educating those managers and leaders to go out there of their own accord and find out what's going on. And, simple questions like, what makes it hard to do your job here? What are the pressures you're under, real or perceived, that limit how you get your job done? And when I would go and coach leaders, I'd just say that there's two really simple questions you can ask: what works and what sucks? And if you just ask those and wait for the stories to come back, and people go, in fact, when I did this in a hospital, there was a lot of complaints about pay, and they went, well, that's not our job to look at the pay conditions. You go, well, it might not be, but unless you do, then it's still going to, you're still going to have these latent conditions that are going to mean the performance is limited. But people don't necessarily want to find out what the bad news is, because if they're the leadership and management, oh, hang on a minute, that's my responsibility to fix.
I've got to do something with that,
right?
Right.
So it's like, oh, shit, okay. And I've got all of the other stuff that I need to get done at the same time. So that work is done goes the other way as well. So you go and speak to people at the front line and you say, so what do you think your manager does? Oh, he just sits on his bum all day with his feet on the desk. And, and it's like, do you realize how much paperwork and process they have to do, which is not adding value, but it's taking time away. And it's great to go and show people the other side, the big picture piece.
Right. And I love the bit you were talking there about. I mean, I use a slightly cruder terminology, so I always turn around and say to people, because I'm looking for a visceral reaction, which is so my question is always, what pisses you off?
Yeah.
Right. I don't want something that's slightly annoying. I want something that's really irritating, because I look at it and say, what is the rule or the corner you're going to cut when push comes to shove? The answer is the thing you have no respect for whatsoever. And that's obstructive. And so if I can get to that visceral reaction, that is something you should take a look at. Now, it might be that they're completely out of line and actually they're being said, but then you can educate them. Yeah. And maybe the thing they're annoyed about is really important. But I love this idea of actually using, what you're talking about there, as I see it, is really saying people actually are really good early warning indicators. So they will clock stuff that you might not, because they've got the experience of doing it. So why not, rather than just kind of being blind to it, is tap into that and understand that process and use that positively?
Oh, massively. This concept of weak signals in high reliability organizations, where they will listen to those weak signals because they're the bits that are coming in, the little things that are said every now and again, which over time can aggregate up, or they can highlight some real workarounds that the operators are doing, and they may not understand the full consequences of the corners they're cutting, because they're being rewarded for productivity and outputs. And so, going back to my area in the diving industry, safety is measured by the number of dead people. Unfortunately, there aren't very many dead people. But whether or not those lack of dead people is because it's luck, or it's, how much of that safety margin is being managed, and how much is being eroded, and how much would it take to get one little step over where then it all goes horribly wrong. And then people go, look at this. So,
and I love that metric, because it's clearly it's a lagging indicator, right? Which is it's basically the horse has bolted. Go, oh, we don't have a horse anymore. And you sort of go, wouldn't it be better? And I find it, I think this holiday about what do you measure in terms of when you're looking at risk/safety, which is the opposite. So, is what do you measure? And very often it is these things that are easy to measure. It's the big things you don't want to have happen are the things you're looking out for, because that's easy. And so you measure. So I'm struck in there's a whole. COVID presents a whole host of opportunities to look at data. But I think there's something interesting around data sets, information that we have versus information that we should have, and the reliance that we place on things. And I think that example of sort of going, well, literally, it's nobody got killed today. We're all right.
Yeah.
Aren't we? And actually, as you say, there could be a ton of clues, and you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to piece them together. That was, there's an early indicator. You can find some leading indicators about things that could happen in the future if you're looking in the right place.
Oh, totally. And I think that bit about looking in the right place is really interesting. So, it's not good to plug another podcast, but Tim Harford's Cautionary Tales.
Plug away. Tim was actually on this podcast a few episodes ago, so I'm delighted for you to re-plug that one.
He talked about Harold Shipman's case and the ability to go and look into data. And had they done that, they would have found the patterns. But because they weren't looking for it, they didn't see it. What I found quite ironic, and I made a comment on LinkedIn about it, was the next episode was about hindsight bias. And it's this bit, it's very easy to know what data to go looking for after the event, because then you can start piecing it together. Because data is just data. It's when you start putting analysis on it, you start, and the context that's there, then you can start to create knowledge and meaning. But just because you've got a whole bucket of data, you don't even know what there's a limit to how much analysis you can do, because you will target that analysis based on what you think the outcomes are going to be. So I did find it quite ironic. There were two really good episodes that went, look, you can find the answers if you look in the data. And the other one was beware of hindsight.
Square that circle, right?
Yeah, so.
And one of the other things you talked about was, on the one hand, we need people to slavishly follow rules. So there are certain processes in diving where you don't want any sense. I don't want someone getting creative with the way they've connected their equipment or in the sort of safety checks. But equally, you need to respond to the environment that's around you, because if you just go down and you've decided, you don't know what fish are going to appear. You don't know what currents might appear. You don't know how the other people on the dive are going to behave. So there's a lot of reacting in the moment and being conscious of your surroundings. And I'm always struck that we very often, when we're trying to think about mitigating human risk, is we do one thing or the other, which is sort of, here is an environment where you just do exactly what you're told, no deviation from that, like a small child almost.
Yeah.
And that, nuclear power is a great example I tend to talk about, or airline safety. I don't want someone playing around with those things, right? So there is or food safety, or any of these sorts of things. But there are lots of other scenarios. Ethics would be a good example, where you want people to absolutely use your initiative. What's appropriate in one situation might not be in another. And I'm really sort of keen to understand how do you see balancing those two things? Because in there are scenarios, and I think this is a good one, where it's not one extreme as the other. It literally is sitting in for this, just slavishly for this bit, think.
Yeah.
How do you balance those two things out and manage the biases around that?
So that, I'm going to say, really boils down to experience. So when you're in a novel environment and a risky environment, hazardous environment, you're going to have to put some constraints in place so that you start to learn the rules of the game, for want of a better term. And then as you build experience up over time, you will start to create more mental patterns. I don't know if Gary Klein's naturalistic decision-making piece. There's a great podcast this week with Red Team Thinking and Bryce Hoffman, and just talking about manuals. He started his work in high-risk fire teams and would ask these guys, so where's the manual for fighting a fire? Well, There is, or rather, it was like, how do you do this? Oh, it's in the manual. There was always this reference to the manual, and you go, okay, can you show us what this looks like? Oh no, it's not written down anywhere. It's passed down as sort of rites of passage and tacit knowledge that goes on. So there are times where they would know absolutely they had to toe the line because it was critical. There was no margin for error. And yet in other situations, they were literally making it up as they went along because there was no book or there was no experience. And what he found was that the way that the experts were able to make better decisions is because they relied on the stories that had been told by previous firefighters. You start as a baby fireman and you start listening to the stories that get told in the crew room. And then you come back from a job and they would debrief it. And all the time you were building up this knowledge base that you couldn't put your finger on, but it could save your life. And so totally there is a bit where total operational freedom, crack on. There's the hard stop, you have to do it this way. But even if you've got you have to do it this way, sometimes you could end up with a scenario that sits outside that box and you are going to be doing something called satisficing. You're going to make it up as you go along and you're going to go, I'll try this. No, shit, that doesn't work. Next, no, that didn't work. Third time, let's go and do this. And so that will then be fed back into, I'm going to say, the system, the people and the designers and things like that. So you have to have significant overtraining and simulation to allow you to build those diverse mental models. And that doesn't happen in the diving industry. It does at an individual or maybe a team level, and people learn by their mistakes, hopefully, and they may share their adverse events, their sort of close calls. But there's a couple of things recently where the book that I wrote, Under Pressure, has got a bunch of stories in it. There's another one called Close Calls, which went out recently by Stratis Cass, which he had nearly 60 stories in there and people talking about close calls. And the idea being to try and change attitudes to say, if we can share these stories, good and bad, then actually we can build a bigger corporate knowledge, for one better term. The barrier to that is people go, well, I wouldn't make that mistake because I'm different. So you've got another cognitive bias that's there of distancing through differencing. I'm different to that, so I don't need to read that. And yet we're all wired the same way, which is why I can take stuff from aviation and healthcare and nuclear and apply it to diving. And people can take my stuff from diving and reapply it back to construction and rail and maritime.
I'm smiling because there's a really interesting conundrum, right? Because on the one hand, you're sort of going, I'm going to tell you a story. And we know that stories are much, that's how we learn things. So that's the way we as a society communicate messages to people. And that's why anecdotes often resonate much more than data. So when we look at that sort of situation, you've got that fine balancing act of, I'm going to tell you a story now because that's a good device for communicating with you, right? This is going to make it real for you. This actually happened. On the other hand, you're absolutely right. The mere fact that it comes in that story packaging equally allows you to turn around and say, well, I'm not that. Let me find a million reasons why this isn't applicable. I'm not that sort of person. He's a complete idiot. Yeah. This is a sort of scenario I'd never. So there are a list of things that allow you to discount it. And I find that really interesting because in a way, I always used to think, well, just tell a story. That'll make it easier. But you're absolutely right. People who are minded to do so will dissect that and find in there narratives that mean it wouldn't apply to them.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And so it's why then exploring the context and the conditions around the absolute decision-making. So the absolute decision-making, obviously people are very defensive of. They wouldn't make stupid decisions. Or they might say, yeah, well, I might do that. I'm a bit clumsy. But they would focus on the very time-bound situation. Whereas actually in the stories that I tried to get out of Under Pressure, and I've gone through some of the stories in Close Calls, they don't focus on the context, and it's the conditions that we need to be looking at. So have you ever found yourself in a situation where you're time pressured, where you've got an authority gradient, where you're dealing with, say, a senior instructor, and you don't want to speak up? that your equipment should have been serviced, but you didn't because you didn't have enough money. You wanted to do this course, and that was perceived to be more important than servicing the equipment. So if you start looking at those conditions and then saying, right, these are error-producing conditions, if you've got a whole bunch of those that are starting to stack up, that's the flag. Because actually, by the time you get to the flawed decision and the outcome, it's too late. You can't stop anything then. You only know that you've made an error at the event when you look back and go, well, that was a bit stupid, wasn't it? As opposed to, oh yeah, I'm under a time pressure here. This is a once and an only trip that I'm on. The forecast for the rest of the week for this weather is rubbish. Today is the only bit. All of these bits that are basically forcing me to say, get in the water now. And the closer you get to that time, the harder it is to say no. There's that little voice that's going, Gareth, this is not where it should be. Yeah, no. And it just gets to the point you go, yeah, okay, fine. I'm not going to get in the water. And it's this recognition that it's always going to be there, or hopefully it's always going to be there. You can come back another time. There is this phrase of, I'd much rather be on the boat thinking I was down below than down below thinking I was back on the boat.
That's great. I love that. Amazing conversation. I could keep going forever, but I want to make sure before we go that we cover your conference, which I saw the speaker outline and I thought was absolutely fascinating. What prompted putting that together, and what, if people are interested in it, we'll put details for all of your things, including your book and this in the show notes. But what could people expect if they signed up for that?
So the idea of the Human Factors in Diving conference, that there hasn't been anything like this. The inspiration was some friends of mine run a company called VetLed, and they ran a Human Factors in Veterinary Medicine conference in February. And I watched some of this and I thought, you know what? I reckon I can do this. And it took me about 3 months before I got off my bum and said, right, going to make it happen. And the idea is that I've brought people from lots of different diving areas, recreational, sports, military, scientific diving, public safety diving in the States. I've got some divers who are in healthcare. So Professor Simon Mitchell was involved in the Ato Gawande World Health Organization Safe Surgical Checklist study. So he did the Kiwi, the New Zealand hospital in Auckland. I've got Diane Chadwick-Jones talking about safety culture within BP and how they turned the culture around internally, which was looking at how adverse events occurred and creating a just culture within the environment or the organization to allow that learning. I've got a trainee astronaut. She's a commercial airline pilot, is going through astronaut training, and she's just started diving. And she's just like, this is great. And there are so many parallels that are going on. And I'm hopefully got somebody from the US Sports Parachute Association talking about how they've changed culture on the drop zones to the ego-driven, let's see how late you can leave the pools to and end up smacking into the ground, breaking legs, killing each other sort of thing, to saying actually that there's nothing worth dying for. So it's really a broad view of human factors in looking at just culture, psychological safety, non-technical skills, and the practical implementation of those in a non-regulated environment and what people can bring into that.
Fantastic. Wow. Well, I was going to get a ticket. I definitely am now. That sounds absolutely amazing. So I will put a link to that in the show notes for people that are interested in it. Again, I'll put a link to your website and to Under Pressure. But Gareth, firstly, thank you for the work that you're doing, because I sense it's really important. And it's one of those things that with hindsight, people look back and why the hell wasn't this there in the first place? But I'm delighted that we've got someone like you pushing this thing forward, because I think, one, it's really important from a safety perspective. But two, I think it's absolutely fascinating. And as you've highlighted, I think there are lessons for plenty of other contexts. And my listeners, even now, who may never have been on a dive, who work in completely different contexts, I think will have taken a tremendous amount from that, which illustrates to your point that we're all human beings and we're all fallible in our own different ways. What you haven't been on this podcast is fallible, because you've been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christian. I really enjoy it. And you can tell that I'm smiling away, even though you can't see me. So as listeners. So thank you very much, and I hope people get something out of it.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Gareth for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Gareth's book, Under Pressure, the Human Factors in Diving Conference, I have bought my ticket now, and Gareth's work at the Human Diver, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If you're interested in human factors, do also check out the podcast episode with Neil Clark that I recorded last year. He specialises in human factors in transport. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. To find out more about human risk, the work that I do with my clients, the Human Risk video blog, and newsletter, visit human-risk.com. You'll find lots of resources there. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.